Napoleon wore a black hat, ate lots of chicken, and conquered half Europe. Napoleon was caught by the British, imprisoned on Elba. He died on the farm.
Well, hello and welcome to the Flipping of the Classroom, your very first video lecture. And what's going to happen here is you'll be watching this lecture at home. You'll be listening. You have some notes to take on it. Fantastic. Most importantly, remember the assignment is that you need to come into class on the day that we discuss it with at least 3 questions for the class. Now, these can be open-ended. They actually can be factually based, something you don't quite understand. Be neat maybe to get a combination of those. So 3 or 4 questions or so. You can watch this at your own pace. You can watch it straight through for 30 minutes, whatever it's going to be. You can get through 10 minutes of it tonight, 10 minutes tomorrow. You can stop, you can rewind, and there are periodic times where I'll ask you to stop and think about something, ask you to press the pause button and do some thinking, and then see where the conversation goes after that. So without further ado, let's move on. The age of Napoleon. First of all, came from an enlightened family. Ask yourself what that means. A noble family, came from some money. One of the things that most people know about Napoleon is that he was a little tiny guy. In fact, a Napoleon complex is a little man that tries to make himself seem big and tough. Well, as Napoleon himself famously said, history is a set of lies that people agree upon. In other words, he wasn't very short. He was about 5'6", which was about average for that date. To get an idea of how impressive he was, when he was your age, he was a lieutenant in the army. Remember that we are now in the Ali can-do crazy evil phase. We've gotten through the National Assembly, the more liberal period. We've gotten through the crazy convention periods, which was more radical. The Directory itself is the attempt to stabilize, eliminate the worst parts, excesses of the violence of the Reign of Terror. And the Directory was never particularly popular and never particularly dependent. And there are numerous attempted coups and attempts to put down the Directory and replace it. Napoleon became a trusted military man. And repeatedly, the Directory had to call him in and say, Monsieur Napoleon, only you can put down this rebellion. Napoleon famously said of a rebellion in Paris that he put down in 1795, that rebellion, I put it down with just a whiff of grape shot. Of course, he said it in French and not with a stupid-sounding fake French accent. A whiff is just a scent or a smell. Grape shot is a type of bullet. So in other words, did Napoleon say he had to work to put down this rebellion? Oh, no. The great Napoleon shows up, rebellion falls apart. He said of himself, and apparently this was true, he had a chest-of-drawer mind. What he means by this is that he carried everything in his head. He probably had a photographic memory, and in effect, it was like he had a filing cabinet. And if he was talking about military affairs, he could speak about all that he knew. If we moved on to economic policy, it was as if he could reach in his brain, open up the file with all the information about economic issues, and begin talking about that. And definitely saw himself as a man of destiny. He was to be great. In 1799, the Directory, which is on its last legs at this point, there is another rebellion. And Mr. Emmanuel Joseph Sayes, you might remember that name. What did he write in 1789 that kind of kicked off the French Revolution? Remember, it was the voice of liberalism, the voice, what is the third estate? Emmanuel Joseph Sayes, who wanted to do away with the old order. At this point, he is one of the 5 men sitting on the Directory. And it is Sayes himself that goes to Napoleon and says, Monsieur Napoleon, you need to overthrow this government and take charge. Maybe stop and think for just a moment, put it on pause, and what would make somebody from 1789 who wants to see dramatic change in France now calling for a return to absolute power in one hand? Stop the tape. Think about that for a moment. Again, the quote, confidence from below, but power from above. There's a new constitution that is driven up, and he names himself first consul, which means leader. This is the consulate. Alexander can do crazy evil. We are in the C period now. 2 years later, he names himself the first consul for life. But to be fair, Napoleon does not want to simply do it himself, so he puts it to an election of the French people. Do they want Napoleon Bonaparte as the first consul for life? Well, you see the results of the votes. 3,011,077 would like Napoleon Bonaparte to be the first consul for life, the lifelong leader. 1,567 do not support that move. Right now, I am looking at my laptop speaking, making that eyebrow raised, looking over my glasses. Yeah, right look. Generally speaking, people don't win 99.97% of any vote. The Church. You recall that in the days of the radical days of the French Revolution, the Catholic Church was forced out. It was replaced by the cult of reason. Church officials were harassed and sometimes worse. Napoleon is not a religious man. I think it's fair to call him essentially an atheist. He had no use for religion, certainly no use for the Catholic Church, unless he could use the Catholic Church. So in fact, Napoleon decides to sign a treaty with the Church. It's called the Concordat, the agreement. What this said is that Catholicism is, fact of the matter, the church of most French people. But it is not the official state religion, and if you want to be a priest or a bishop within France, you sign a loyalty oath, a statement of loyalty to the state, which by this point was Napoleon, and if you chose not to be Catholic, to be Protestant, to be Jewish, to be a non-believer, it's your business. Why would the church accept this? Stop the tape. And if you think about it, the church had nothing. The church was basically driven out of France. It was a way back in. Some of you might recall from last year that the Emperor Charlemagne, and I believe it's in the year 800, but I could be wrong, went down to the Vatican and the Pope placed the crown on Charlemagne's head. And you'll recall what that meant was he is now the ruler of the Christian Europe, has now got validity from the church. It's got the support of the church. Charlemagne in 800 became, in essence, the first Holy Roman Emperor. Well, Napoleon goes down to the Vatican too. But you know what Napoleon does? He does not wait for the Pope to put the crown on his head. Napoleon grabs it out of the hands of the Pope and places it on his own head. And again, stop the tape for a second. Tell me, what do you think that says that Napoleon would crown him? Oh, just one step further. How do we know that Alan can do crazy evil? Well, in 1804, Napoleon simply goes a step further and says, "Hello, I am the Emperor, Emperor Napoleon the First, le Premier de France." So in 1804 until 1815, it is the Empire period of Alan can do crazy evil. No major changes, it's simply a change in title, but if you see how how he had himself painted here, what does that say about Napoleon and his view toward himself and the image? Fourth, as a ruler within France, when we talk about liberal, you might ask yourselves, once again, stop the tape for a second, see if you can identify for yourself what liberal means. If you came up with ideas of individual freedom, of people making up their own minds, of limited government restrictions, well, in a lot of ways, the liberal reforms of the early and reinstitutes them. Religious tolerance, believe what you want to believe, as long as you also believe in Napoleon. He famously said, "Careers open to men of talent." You know what? It's a meritocracy. The idea that if you were capable, you were hardworking, it didn't matter your background, rich or poor, Catholic or not Catholic. And for Napoleon, this included some of those emigres, some of those old royalists who had fought the French Revolution and left the country. Listen, come on back, serve the state, serve Napoleon, all is forgiven. The gains of the peasants, absolutely, feudalism is dead. The Napoleonic law code, which is still in effect in France and many parts of the world today. The bottom line is everybody is equal under the law. It doesn't matter if you're from a rich background, from a poor background. The law wasn't cute and cuddly. There were severe punishments at times. But by God, at least you knew what the law was. And notice that he outlawed, quote, only true crimes, not phony offenses created by superstition, feudalism, and despotism. So a law that would say you're going to jail for not tipping your hat at a noble or for speaking out against the church, not something Napoleon was going to worry about. However, ask yourself, would criticizing Napoleon be considered a true crime? On the other hand, Napoleon was a dictator. Well, that election, that plebiscite, that yes or no vote in which Napoleon was confirmed by 99.9% of Frenchmen, that was the last election. Restricted speech, well, you were free to speak your mind to criticize Napoleon's enemies, that is true. But the moment you questioned Napoleon Bonaparte or all that he supported, it was out of the question. Well, he did establish peace after these ongoing wars between revolutionary France and the rest of Europe, and that peace lasted about 15 minutes until he started invading. Napoleon, there we go. This is how Napoleon wanted to be seen. And if you're saying, looks like the ancient Roman Empire, you're right. I'll let you pause the film for just a second here. These are some of the famous sayings of Napoleon Bonaparte. Would like you to select one of them in particular. Read them over, and when we talk in class, maybe choose one of these to tell me, what is Napoleon saying? What does it say about? Stop the film. Have a look. We move then into the period, the Wars of Napoleon's. They are not non-stop 16 years of warfare, but it comes pretty close to being that. I mentioned that 15 minutes peace. Okay, it was a few months of 1803. Who's on Napoleon's side? Who's against it? Well, right now, I am walking toward you. Yes, you. Yes, you. And I've got my fist raised, and I'm about to smack it down on your head until you scream, bop. Balance of power. It became clear to many within Europe that Napoleon with unlimited strength would be bad for all concerned. Countries before then, Prussia and Austria and Russia, tend for the most part to be working with Napoleon because they don't think they can challenge him. But you'll see, when they see the possibility of weakness, they turn. And from 1813 on, the four major European powers are standing united against him. Again, stop the film for a second. Who are those four major European powers? He controlled, by 1810, most of continental Europe, and we will. Worth mentioning, and this is fascinating, it's its own story, but Haiti, which you'll recall, was one of those sugar plantation colonies. A vast majority of the population enslaved Africans and their descendants, horrifying conditions. Well, the spirit of the French Revolution spreads. A Toussaint Louverture was his name. Actually said, this is, these rights to all human beings should apply to us. Over the course of the next decade, he leads a revolution against the French slave owners. By 1804, Napoleon, who is so focused at this point on what is going on in Europe and his attempts to conquer, that he ultimately lets Haiti go. And Haiti becomes an independent republic since 1804. It is entirely black-run, which is unique, certainly in the Western Hemisphere, and close to being unique in the world for a country of that size. Notice that he also, at this point, because he doesn't want to focus on the Americas, he sells Louisiana, an area he'd taken back from Spain earlier, to the United States. We'll come back to Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution. So there's Europe in 1812. And what you've in essence got is France, of course, right in the middle. And then you've got the area under direct French control, i.e. most of Spain and most of the old Holy Roman Empire. And then you've got the areas allied to France. Oh, the Austrians, the Russians, the Danes, the Norwegians, less important perhaps these two countries. Why are they aligned with Napoleon? Because they love Napoleon, they respect Napoleon. It's because they don't dare challenge Napoleon. Alone, aside from the crumbling Ottoman Empire, which we will see cease to exist about a century later, you've got England. This is a famous painting by Francisco Goya of the revolution in Spain against Napoleon's forces. Napoleon, for all of his talk about good government, the rule of law, careers open to men of talent, he also loved to put family members in important positions. His brother, I think Joseph or Ferdinand, I forget, actually became the king of Spain at this point. There's a spirited Spanish revolt, which in retrospect showed some limits to Napoleon's control over the rest of Europe. This is how Napoleon loved to be pictured. Jacques Louis David, who had done many of the famous paintings from the French Revolution, in effect became Napoleon's court painter at this point. And Napoleon, this is how he saw himself and wanted to be seen. Well, how did Napoleon deal? Since he controlled most of Europe, well, how did he have his people rule Europe? He was two things: a rationalist and a universalist. What does it mean to be rational? It means to be scientific, to be logical, to work on facts, not just superstition or whim. And a universal belief means a belief that applies everywhere. So as a universalist, and by the way, this is strictly out of the Enlightenment. Remember, he came from an enlightened, educated family. He was born 20 years after Voltaire's death and 50 years after Locke's death. His idea was that there is one set of rules, of systems, that applies to everybody. So when he moved into these areas, he was not happy to simply let the Prussians and the Austrians and the Russians, well, just do things they've been doing them. He brought his rule of law. The Napoleonic codes were applied. In areas where he conquered, he ended feudalism. He demanded that the legal system give everybody, rich, poor, you name it, equal treatment under the law. Religious tolerance, allowing the local religion, the Catholic Church in most cases, special privileges, done. But something that he didn't expect to do. He expected to be loved by the European masses he was bringing some degrees of freedom to. Turns out that German people, Czech people, Greek people didn't want to be ruled by the French. And if we start talking about a modern Europe where Germany is Germans and Italians are Italians and Czechs are Czechs and Greece is run by Greeks, it starts during this period. Napoleon, much to his unhappiness, creates a real sense of nationalism. Because the people within, say, the German states who had never been unified, now they have a reason to be unified against outside control. Interesting how you see that. Mention that England was not in that buddy situation or accepting situation. England was, of course, the cheese that stands alone. Why? Well, look up here at the map. England cannot be easily invaded. Quick quiz, when is the last time that England was successfully invaded from outside? The answer is that it was 949 years ago, in 1066, the Norman invasion. When you folks in this room turn 65, 66, something like that, that will be the 1,000-year anniversary of the last successful invasion of Great Britain. And why? Simply because of that 25 miles of water. Napoleon could line his soldiers up. Anybody could line his soldiers here up on the coast of France, but getting them logistically to England was very difficult. Keep in mind, I will be 102 years old at that point, and when that date comes in the year 2066, that would be a good time to think, I remember that guy. He's 102 now, better buy him an expensive birthday present. We'll come back to that idea later. England has also got a superior navy, so it's able to protect itself, and England, we'll be getting this in the next unit, is different than the rest of the world. England is heavily into industrialization. They are no longer having shop makers make 10 chairs in a week. They are making 10 chairs in an hour. They are producing massive amounts of stuff using factories, using coal power and steam power to be able to create more stuff to buy, sell, and trade across the world. Napoleon referred to them with some contempt as, England is a nation of shopkeepers. Now, what did Napoleon mean by that? Unlike we French, they are not manly and militaristic. Their power goes through buying and selling goods. But it does keep England tremendously powerful. Well, Napoleon knows that he can't invade England. What he can do is try to destroy them economically. And because Napoleon controls, either directly or indirectly, all of these areas in Europe, he's able to stop all these countries from importing English goods. Nobody within this whole area in continental Europe will be allowed to trade with England. And if Austria, or part of the Rhine Confederation, the old Holy Roman Empire, or the Norwegians, or the Spanish, or the Russians attempt to trade with England, this means war. And because Napoleon's army was so powerful, most accepted this. This ban was a disaster. First of all, it really hurt the French economy and the others on the continent. This was hurting especially the growingly powerful merchant and industrial class across Europe. Economically, it hurt people. And as you probably know from history, when people aren't doing well economically, they're not all that thrilled with the people ruling them. Secondly, it didn't really affect Great Britain at all. Napoleon was behind on the times. Oh, we can't trade with Europe? Fine. We have our empire in India. We can continue trade across the Atlantic with the United States and Canada. So it ended up not being much of an issue. Napoleon famously, when he looked back at what happened and the failure of the continental system to bring England to its knees, Napoleon said, sacre bleu, the destinies of Europe turned on a barrel of sugar. Stop the film and think about what that means for a second. So here we are, Europe in the early 19th century. See various ethnic populations. Notice this area, the Habsburg Empire, the Austria-Hungarian Empire as it later becomes known, tremendously ethnically diverse. And Napoleon's empire once again. The beginning at the end. Tsar Alexander I of Russia announces in 1812 that he is going to withdraw from the continental system. What does that mean? Russia will not be controlled by Napoleon France. Russia will trade with England if it wishes to. Well, for this continental system to work, it can't be partial. Countries cannot be allowed to pick and choose whether or not they individually will continue to trade with England. So Napoleon announces that he will invade Russia in June of 1812. He comes in with his so-called Grand Army, 750,000 soldiers, the largest army that had been seen in Europe. And interestingly, less than a third of it was French. Who were the others? Well, they were Spanish, they were Austrian, they were German, they were Czechs, they were Poles, some of whom were perhaps true believers, more either forced to enlist or it was a job. And they are ready for a quick victory. And in fact, within about 3 months, French soldiers march across Russia all the way to Moscow, which is something like 1,500 miles or 2,000 kilometers away from the Russian border by September. And this looks like the battle didn't quite turn out that way. You might notice from this painting, if you get to September, October, November, December, January, in Russia, 90% of which lies north of the American-Canadian border. It gets cold, cold, cold. And the French supplies, coming all the way from Central Europe, will be thousands of miles away across non-existent roads. In fact, part of the plan, from the Russian point of view, Tsar Alexander told his soldiers to let Napoleon win. Stood back, simply let Napoleon's armies march across Russia, and when they got on the gates of Russia, Well, Tsar Alexander himself had the Russian army burn it to the ground. Why? Well, why would Tsar Alexander not want to keep Moscow whole when Napoleon comes through? Well, think about all the supplies, the food, the weapons. They were destroyed. So Napoleon is able to get to Moscow, no problem at all, but now it's getting cold, and now he's running out of food supplies. We call this a scorched earth plan. The Russians had completely wiped out the supplies, the food supplies, everything else, and Napoleon finds himself around Moscow in December, January of 1813, thinking, wow, we won, but my soldiers are hungry, they're cold, they're freezing, we don't have uniforms, we're running out of weapons, better retreat for the time being. And as they begin to retreat back to Europe, that's when the Russians begin to attack. 600,000, maybe 700,000 French soldiers enter Russia, fewer than 100,000 return. Hundreds of thousands killed, many more captured, and many, many more simply abandoned the fight. Remember, most of them were not French. Napoleon's Grand Army has been completely destroyed. This is the end of Napoleon? Well, almost. Once the Russians have defeated him, revolts break out in Italy, Spain, Prussia, and Austria. The Quadruple Alliance, the four countries that had all been opposed to Napoleon but mainly afraid to take him on, with the exception of England, come together. Prussia, Russia, Austria, and England, and they formed the Quadruple Alliance. Napoleon is forced to abdicate, to give up his emperorship, and is sent off exiled to a small island, a Mediterranean Adriatic Sea, I believe, called Elba. And Louis the 18th is reinstated to the throne. Wait, we're missing a Louis. We have Louis the 14th, the Sun King. We have Louis XV until 1774, Après-moi le déluge. We have Louis XVI during the French Revolution, who met his very unhappy end in 1793. Louis XVII. Well, Louis XVII died while imprisoned during the French Revolution, and the monarchists who wanted to bring the Bourbon family back to power said he was the rightful king, Louis XVII, who never got to hold his crown. So the next guy coming in, Bourbon family member, grandson, I believe, of Louis XVI, is Louis XVIII. But Napoleon's not done yet. He escapes from the island, and in a 100-day period, he raises an army and wages war once again. However, he is defeated by the Quadruple Alliance in a place in modern-day Belgium, Waterloo. And Waterloo is a fairly famous metaphor. If you were to say you've met your Waterloo, it means that you have been defeated once and for all. I hope for none of you will look back at this class over the years as your Waterloo, because I don't believe it will be. You're doing well. So as of 1815, Napoleon is officially, finally removed. He's sent even farther away in exile and dies about... Well, what to do? We've ended the war. How do we make the peace? This is called the Peace of Vienna, sometimes called the Concert of Vienna. In other words, everyone playing together. Now, not surprisingly, in determining what happens to France, what happens to all the lands Napoleon took over, we understand why the winners, England, Prussia, Russia, and Austria, would be there. But the French are also invited to participate. Because right now I'm coming at you, yes you, with my hand in a fist, and I'm about to bop it down on your head until you say... That's right, balance of power. The representatives from England, France, Russia, and Austria, as much as they may have disliked Napoleon and the French, they did not want to see a completely weakened, humiliated France, because that would lead to competition over who controlled France and maybe a new war. What comes part of this? Well, the Netherlands and Poland, both taken over by Napoleon, become new countries again. You would think, because they lost a war that they had cost, that the French would be deeply punished. The French, in essence, were able to keep the land that they had at the beginning of the French Revolution. Sympathy for France? Probably not. Wanting to avoid anger and competition that could lead to new war? In fact, France in 1818, 4 years later, the enemy for 15 years, hey, come on in, join the club. We're now the Quintuple Alliance. And you know what? This largely works. There are a couple of major wars, but not major, not lengthy, only short-lasting for the next 100 years, leading many Europeans by the early 1900s to think, we are wonderful and sophisticated. We have moved beyond war. The events of 1914 put that little illusion to an end. We'll talk about that next. Yep, here we are, map of the new France, that was the old Europe and the new Europe under Napoleon, and finally after the Peace of Vienna. Notice still no united Germany, no united Italy, but that's coming 50 years down the road. You'll notice that France is down to its initial borders. You'll notice the Netherlands and Poland are back. And Prussia, the major German state, here and here both, becomes probably the major power in continental Europe within the next 20, 30 years, and eventually turns into Germany. You know, some questions to ask yourself, and we can talk about this in class. I'll ask you to stop the tape for a moment, but ask yourselves, would you call Napoleon a great man? He's considered, quote, one of the great men of history. Do you admire him? What's good about him? Or was it his ego just led to war and the killings of millions? Did he betray the French Revolution, or did he actually reinforce the French Revolution? And how should the rest of Europe look at him? Did he liberate them from an old, feudal, superstitious past, or was he just another dictator? And finally, looking back at the French Revolution, did it succeed? Well, yeah, it did end the feudal system in Western Europe forever. It was the beginning of the end of that, and that was certainly a goal. And put people at the front of politics. You can be the worst dictator in the world today, and you cannot pretend for a second that you don't care about the people, that the people's voice doesn't matter. You have dictatorships across the world that stage expensive elections. Why? Because, by God, I have to at least pretend that the people matter. And we've seen many cases since the French Revolution of people genuinely taking their own lives into their hands. And that's part of the spirit of the French and also American revolutions. And you know what? Maybe in France it returned to a dictatorship, but the ideas of the French Revolution, the rights of man and the citizen, the basic ideas, the liberal ideas, the Enlightenment, spread not only throughout Europe, but throughout the world, to be sure. And that ancien regime, that old regime, yes, Louis XVIII and the Bourbon family comes back, but it does not hold the type of power that it did. And within another 50 years, there is no more monarchy within France at all. And again, those ideals. You might remember that Robespierre at the very end thought, perhaps I have failed, but at least those ideals of liberté, égalité, et fraternité, which is horribly pronounced, you can all do it better, but the ideas of liberty, equality, brotherhood among human beings. Maybe it took a while to work out, but that's something that the world, the French today, and everybody in the world still believes to be important. Nah, it didn't succeed. Look, it didn't work. You had a couple of years of the assembly, a few years the convention, which ended in bloodshed, the directory, which never worked, and then you just end up with a brand new dictatorship in Napoleon. After a reign of terror that kills 30, 40,000 people, that leads to warfare throughout Europe, look, whatever the ideals, it didn't work somewhere. And let's see if this works, because I have a French Revolution song for you.
Sold to a priest. I saw the man of reason bow down to the east. Oh, it's better to know. Oh, it's better to know. Truth can make you bitter, even what I've said to free. The truth's a haunting, taunting mistress. She ain't been good to liberty is still a noble cause. And oh, it's better to know. Oh, I swear it's better to know. All the forces of distortion, all the pretty words you said, the elephant in your living room, the fascist in your bed, and oh, it's better to know. Oh, I swear it's better to know. Even from so long, so long, we've been so long, so long, we've been so
Okay, not exactly a French Revolution song, but I think you can apply some of the messages anyhow, maybe inspired by directly or indirectly. Hey, that's it. So I'd hope to get it in 30 minutes. Actually, if you exclude the 40-second musical introduction and about the 4 minutes there, I think I got it in about 32, which isn't too bad. So watch, stop, respond to some of the questions, go back through it again. There's a particular area you don't understand. Hey, final mention, YTD YouTube downloader. If you have very slow internet connection that won't let you stream it, you can probably easily download that and then just simply save the file to your own laptop. Anyway, come on in with the questions. We'll talk about it. Thanks for listening. And God, I hope this saves properly because sometimes it doesn't and I have to do it again.